Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Benin City was always alive, a city where the hum of commerce and the chatter of street vendors formed a symphony that never seemed to rest. On a busy weekday morning, traffic crawled like a wounded animal along the Usulu-Lagos road, horns blaring as impatient drivers shouted at one another. The sharp aroma of suya being roasted at a roadside stand mixed with the oily scent of fried akara drifting from women's frying pans. In the middle of all this chaos stood Tun's small cyber cafe, sandwiched between a tailoring shop with faded posters and a barbershop where loud music never stopped playing. Inside his cafe, rows of dusty computers lined the walls, most of them old models with keyboards missing letters, but to Tund, it was the beating heart of his ambition. He often boasted that though his shop was small, one day, something mighty would rise from within its walls. He was not an idle dreamer, his mind was restless, forever chasing the elusive promise of success. Yet, for all his ambition, his cafe barely paid the bills, and many nights he returned home frustrated, muttering that life had dealt him a crooked hand. His wife, Bimbo, would meet him at the door with her calm smile, her soft voice like cool water poured over hot coals. Neighbors sometimes shook their heads, wondering why a woman with a PhD chose to tie wrapper around her waist and live as a housewife. To them, she was wasting her light, but Bimbo saw life differently. She was a woman who believed that greatness did not always shout. Sometimes it spoke in whispers. Her days were spent keeping her home in order, tending to her husband's moods, and finding quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of ordinary life. She was the kind of woman whose patience could hold back a flood. And it was in this city, amidst the noise of ambition and the weight of expectation, that their story began to take shape. One evening, after the chaos of the day had died down, Tun sat in his cafe long after the last customer had left. The hum of the old ceiling fan filled the silence, its blades spinning lazily, as though even it was tired of working. On his computer screen, lines of code blinked back at him, stubborn and unyielding, as if mocking his efforts. He had been working on a software idea for months, something that could change his fortunes if only it would come together. His fingers tapped furiously on the keyboard, but the more he typed, the more confused he became. It was like chasing shadows. Every time he thought he had found the missing link, it slipped through his grasp. The frustration boiled inside him like hot oil. He leaned back, ran his hands over his head, and sighed deeply. The cafe felt like a prison that night, each blinking cursor a jailer laughing at him. Just then, the door creaked open softly, and Bimbo stepped in. She had brought him a cup of steaming tea, its sweet aroma wafting through the air. Her eyes scanned the screen, and she noticed his frown. "You've been at this since morning," she said gently, placing the cup beside him. "Have you tried linking that function to this section instead?" she added, pointing at a line of code with the ease of someone who understood more than she let on. Tun frowned, hesitated, then tried it. In an instant, the system responded. The program came alive. It was as though a blindfold had been removed. His heart pounded with excitement, and he leapt to his feet. "Bimbo, you're a genius." "This is it," he exclaimed, pulling her into an embrace. She only smiled, brushing it off as though it were nothing. But deep inside, she knew her quiet contribution had just lit a torch in the darkness, and that torch would soon burn brighter than either of them could imagine. The days that followed carried with them a strange kind of electricity. Tun poured himself into his work with renewed energy, his excitement like that of a child who had just discovered a secret treasure chest. The cafe became more than just a place to check emails or print documents. It turned into a small laboratory of dreams. Customers who once came only to browse the internet now whispered to each other about the man building something new, something that could change the way businesses worked in Benin City and beyond. Tun's eyes glowed with pride whenever he spoke about the project, often telling anyone who cared to listen that this was the dawn of a new era. But in his excitement, he sometimes forgot that it was Bimbo's gentle insight that had unlocked the puzzle. She never reminded him, though. She was content to sit in the shadows, her satisfaction drawn from seeing him happy, even if her name was never mentioned. In the evenings, when the street outside their home grew quiet and the distant sound of crickets filled the air, Bimbo would sit with her wrapper tied around her chest, watching her husband sketch diagrams in his notebook with a fire in his eyes she hadn't seen before. She would smile, nod, and encourage him, even when his ideas seemed too wild. To her, supporting him was not a duty, it was an act of love. She knew that dreams often began like small seeds buried in soil, invisible to the world but destined to break through when the season was right. And though she did not yet know it, her small act of kindness that evening in the cafe had planted a seed that would grow into a tree whose branches stretched far beyond their imagination. Yet, beneath the excitement of his newfound breakthrough, there lingered in Tun's heart a restlessness that refused to die. Success had not yet come, but he could already taste it, and that taste made him hungrier by the day. He walked the streets of Benin with his head held high, imagining the applause, the recognition, the wealth that would surely follow once his software saw the light of day. Sometimes he would sit in the middle of his cafe, staring at the blinking screens, his thoughts racing ahead into a future paved with glass towers and international contracts. He began to speak differently, to dream out loud in a way that made neighbors whisper about his ambition. This man day see tomorrow for him eyes, one mechanic who often came to his cafe said to a friend. But ambition, like fire, is both a light and a danger. While Tun saw the future burning bright, he did not notice that Bimbo, the quiet force behind his first breakthrough, remained in the background, her strength hidden in plain sight. She never asked for credit, never demanded recognition. Instead, she chose silence, the kind of silence that carried weight. She knew her time would come, not by force, not by boastfulness, but by the quiet certainty that truth always rises, even when buried under shadows. And so, as Benin City roared on with its endless noise, as buses screeched to stops and traders hawked their wares with voices hoarse from shouting, inside a modest home not far from Ugbowo, a story was taking root. It was the story of a man blinded by ambition, and a woman whose quiet wisdom would one day eclipse his pride. The city did not so much change as it shifted its weight like a restless sleeper. One morning you woke to find the balance had tilted, and the street that used to know your footsteps by heart now bent towards your name with deference. That was how it felt for Tund after the software launched. The cafe that once echoed with the hum of printers and the sighs of weary students was no longer just a room of computers. It became the birthplace of something larger, a story whispered beyond Benin City into Lagos, Abuja, even Accra. Clients began to arrive not with hurried coins in their palms, but with contracts in leather folders, with handshakes that tried to measure the worth of his time. The name SwiftNet shifted from painted signboard to brand, and suddenly, the dream that had once struggled to stand on spindly legs was striding down highways. Bimbo watched this unfolding with the quietness of one who had long seen the seeds before others noticed the soil. She kept their home steady, rising early to prepare his meals, answering his distracted mutterings with nods, managing their household as the money began to flow in like tides that refused to turn back. But prosperity has a peculiar smell. It clings to a man and makes him visible to eyes that previously glanced away. The very people who once walked past Tund without greeting began to pause, tip their heads, and call his name with familiarity, as if they had been neighbors in another life. Market women started offering him the biggest pieces of meat, even when he insisted he wanted less. Landlords who had ignored his rent pleas now phoned to suggest plots of land he might want to buy. The air shifted around him, thick with expectation, with praise, with the intoxicating perfume of recognition. And slowly, like palm wine that ferments unnoticed until it froths over, Tund began to drink it all in. At first, it was harmless. New clothes tailored in fabrics he had never before dared to touch, a wristwatch that glittered under sunlight like it had its own heartbeat, shoes that squeaked softly against polished tiles. He began to speak louder at meetings, his laughter carrying the sharp edge of someone who wanted to be heard in every corner of the room. Invitations poured in, tech conferences in Abuja, seminars in Port Harcourt, interviews where young journalists angled cameras toward him like students desperate to copy notes before the bell rang. Bimbo attended the first few with him, her scarf neatly tied, her presence a steady anchor as he spoke about innovation, about the future, about building systems that matched Africa's pulse. But gradually, she found herself excusing out of trips, preferring the rhythm of home, the comfort of kitchens where peppers steamed, the quiet company of her books. She watched as new faces crowded around her husband, laughing too eagerly at jokes, clapping too long after his speeches, feeding him the kind of attention that swells a man's head until it floats above his shoulders. The staff at the cafe changed too. Instead of students and retirees, he hired young assistants in crisp shirts, people who knew how to say yes, sir, with the right bend in their voices. They ran errands, fetched documents, polished his shoes until he could see his reflection. Among them were young women with bright lipstick and bold perfumes, women who leaned closer than necessary when showing him figures on a screen, whose laughter carried the sound of promises. Tund, who once wiped desks himself with an old cloth, now barely touched anything except his car keys and his phone. And though Bimbo noticed the shift, she kept her observations folded neatly like laundry in a trunk, hoping that this was only the intoxication of a man tasting success for the first time, that it would pass as quickly as it came. But pride is a subtle thief. It does not steal everything at once. It starts with little coins and returns later for the treasures. One evening, Bimbo sat at the dining table, waiting with bowls of steaming yam porridge, but the chair across from her stayed empty long after the food turned cold. She finally heard his car outside, a horn blowing like a trumpet announcing royalty. When he entered, the air around him smelled faintly of another woman's perfume, sweet but sharp, clashing with the warmth of home. His tie was loosened, his shirt creased in ways that did not come from boardroom chairs. "Sorry, Bim," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Work ran late." She looked at him, her spoon still in her hand, but said nothing. She had learned that sometimes silence weighs heavier than words. Days turned into weeks, and absences became routine. Meetings stretched into late nights. Phone calls ended abruptly when she entered the room. New numbers appeared on his phone, saved with initials that explained nothing. The city's gossip was a sly animal, and it reached her ears in the market, in whispers from women who shook their heads with pity. "Your husband day shine, oh. Always in company." She carried the weight quietly, keeping her dignity like a cloak around her shoulders, for she refused to be the woman who fought in public over scraps of her husband's attention. Yet her heart trembled at night when the bed felt too wide, when the sound of his breathing no longer matched hers, when the man who once shared his failures and hopes with her now guarded his phone as if it were a diary of sins. The day she caught him, it was not through whispers or suspicion, but with the naked clarity of eyes. She had gone to his office to deliver a folder he had left behind, the receptionist too distracted to stop her. She pushed open his door and found him leaning close to a young woman, laughter spilling between them like spilled wine staining a carpet. The woman's hand rested lightly on his wrist, and though nothing scandalous had yet happened, the intimacy was unmistakable, the betrayal already written. Their eyes met, tongues wide with shock, Bimbo's calm with a pain that cut deeper than screams. She placed the folder on his desk, her movements steady as a surgeon's, and said softly, "You forgot this." Then she turned and walked out, her steps firm though her chest burned. That night, he came home late, found her sitting in the living room without the television on. He dropped to his knees before her, words tumbling from his mouth like coins from a broken purse. "Bimbo, please forgive me. It was nothing, it won't happen again. You know I love you, you know you are my everything." His tears wet her hands as he clutched them, but she remained still, her silence more powerful than his begging. At length she spoke, her voice quiet but strong. "You have broken something. I can forgive, but it may never be whole again." And though she did forgive, though she let him rise and eat from the food she reheated with trembling fingers, inside her heart something shifted permanently, like a pillar cracked at its base, still standing, but weakened, waiting for the weight that might one day bring it down. The days that followed were neither storm nor sunshine, but something in between, a twilight of strained smiles and brittle silences. Tund, shaken by the discovery, worked hard to mend his image at home. He brought flowers that wilted quickly in vases. He returned with gifts wrapped in shiny paper that looked loud against the quietness of their living room. He offered apologies as though repetition could scrub away memory. Bimbo accepted each gesture without protest, her face calm, her words measured, but her heart remained a guarded place. She no longer looked at him with the same openness as before. Her eyes, once wells of unspoken support, now carried a lid that closed often. Tund mistook her silence for forgiveness fully won, and soon the urgency of his remorse dulled, giving way again to the distractions of his world outside. Yet the shift was irreversible. Bimbo began to turn inward, not in bitterness but in reflection. It was during this period she rekindled her friendship with Charles, an old colleague from her academic days. Their paths crossed at a lecture in the University of Benin, where she had gone to collect documents for a friend. Charles recognized her immediately, his handshake warm, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who had always admired her mind. They caught up over steaming plates of jollof at a campus canteen, the kind of place where voices clashed with cutlery, and where conversations had no room for pretensions. Charles spoke of his work in software development, of frustrations with companies that wanted brilliance but paid peanuts, of ideas he nursed quietly in notebooks filled with scribbles and diagrams. Bimbo listened, her curiosity awakened in a way she had not felt in years, and for the first time she considered the possibility of building something outside her husband's shadow. It was not rebellion at first, only a flicker of interest, like a candle lit in a corner of a room that had been dark too long. Charles had always been the sort of thinker who saw patterns where others saw clutter. He carried a notebook everywhere, pages filled with sketches of systems, diagrams that mapped possibilities. Over lunch one afternoon, he pulled out the battered book and showed her a series of flowcharts that described a new kind of software, an upgrade of what she knew Tund had built, but smarter, more adaptable, designed for the unpredictable rhythms of African markets. It would not just record data, it would anticipate behavior, flag irregularities, adapt to network fluctuations with the patience of a market woman calculating change under pressure. Bimbo's eyes followed the arrows, the loops, the blocks of logic, and with each page her interest deepened. She asked questions, sharp and probing, and Charles answered with the passion of a man who believed he had been misunderstood for too long. "If only I had backing," he said with a wry smile, "this thing would stand taller than anything we've seen." Bimbo sat quietly after he spoke, the hum of the canteen washing over her like a tide. The idea was dangerous in its allure. She knew the code of loyalty, said she ought to carry this home to her husband, to present it as an extension of what he had started. But another voice whispered, softer yet insistent, reminding her of the perfume she had smelled on his shirts, of the laughter she had overheard, of the quiet betrayals patched with gifts. Why should she keep handing over her brilliance to a man who squandered not only her trust, but the very foundation of their marriage? That night, lying beside Tund as he scrolled through his phone in the glow of the screen, she stared at the ceiling and felt the flicker grow into a flame. She would not tell him. This time, she would keep the light for herself. The partnership began quietly, almost invisibly. Charles would visit her at home under the pretense of discussing academic work, or they would meet in small cafes far from the eyes of Tund's circle. They divided tasks between them. Charles, with his restless coding, handled the architecture of the system, while Bimbo, with her sharp understanding of people and institutions, crafted the vision, the design of use, the way the software would fit into lives like water into clay pots. Her PhD training became a weapon sharpened by patience. She broke down user scenarios, questioned assumptions, demanded resilience in every line of code. "Don't build it for perfect days," she would tell him, her voice firm. "Build it for when NEPA takes light, when internet crawls, when sellers are too tired to enter figures correctly." Charles admired her not just as a friend, but as a collaborator who lifted his ideas into structures with roofs and windows. Together, they tested prototypes in secret, feeding them with dummy data until the system began to breathe like a living thing. And all the while, Tund remained oblivious, wrapped in his world of parties, deals, and public acclaim. He boasted about his achievements on stages, never knowing that the foundation under his feet was already being shaken by footsteps he did not hear. Sometimes, Bimbo would watch him as he bragged over dinner with guests, talking about his software with a pride that filled the room, and she would feel a quiet irony settle over her. He had built something once, yes, but the better version, the stronger future, was taking shape in shadows he had dismissed. It was like watching a storm gather while the village still danced under the clear sky, unaware of what loomed on the horizon. By the time a year passed, their creation had grown teeth and wings. The software was no longer just an idea, it was a force waiting to be unleashed. Bimbo and Charles had filed documents, registered a company, secured silent investors who believed in the vision, but had no idea of her connection to Tund. She moved through this double life with the grace of a dancer balancing on a tightrope. At home she played the dutiful wife, preparing meals, attending functions, nodding at his stories. In private she was a strategist, an innovator, a woman reclaiming the parts of herself she had once surrendered. There were nights when doubt crept in, whispering that she was betraying not just a man but the vows she had spoken, and in those moments she clutched at the memory of his perfume-stained shirts, of the humiliation of whispers in the market. Her decision hardened like clay and fire. Meanwhile, Tund's appetite for distractions only deepened. He bought another car, a sleek black SUV that prowled through the streets of Benin like a lion through brush. He surrounded himself with women whose laughter was too shrill, whose presence was too eager, their admiration feeding the ego that had grown fat on applause. The gulf between him and Bimbo widened with each passing week, though he did not notice. He was too busy standing under spotlights to see the shadows he cast at home. And so the stage was set, two rivers flowing side by side, destined to clash. One was loud, boastful, and shallow. The other was quiet, deep, and gathering force. When they finally collided, only one would remain strong enough to carve a new course. The first whispers of triumph did not arrive like drums. They came like raindrops tapping on zinc, steady, quiet, but undeniable. Bimbo and Charles had finally tested their upgraded software in the real world. They began small, with a pharmacy on Airport Road whose books were always in disarray, receipts fluttering like restless birds, inventory figures that never seemed to match the shelves. Within weeks of using the new system, the pharmacist smiled like a man suddenly free of a burden. The software balanced accounts, tracked sales even when the internet crawled like a snail, and generated reports sharp enough to impress auditors. Word spread in the way that useful things always do, faster than gossip, steadier than rumor. Soon, other businesses began to adopt it. A chain of boutiques in GRA, a printing press near Ring Road, a busy supermarket where cashiers once fumbled with calculators. Each success became a thread in a net that stretched wider and wider, pulling in attention, investment, and respect. Contracts landed softly on Bimbo's desk like fruits dropping from a ripened tree. She and Charles worked long nights in hushed rooms, tweaking, refining, ensuring the system bent with reality, but never broke. With each version, their creation grew sharper, sturdier, almost as if it had its own ambition. Bimbo moved through these days with a kind of quiet exhilaration she had never tasted. She was no longer just the wife who brewed tea and reheated food. She was a builder, a thinker, a leader whose mind was shaping something people depended on. Yet she carried her secret like a hidden jewel, never letting it flash in the light of home, where Tun still lived oblivious, dancing on the remnants of his fading empire. Meanwhile, Tun's world was beginning to tilt, though he did not see the slope at first. His original software, once hailed as a breakthrough, started to show cracks. Clients complained about glitches that froze their operations, about modules that could not keep up with expanding businesses, about data losses that cost them money. Some grew frustrated enough to leave, whispering of another product that was smoother, more reliable, more attuned to the chaos of Nigeria's unpredictable systems. At first, Tun dismissed these whispers as the usual restlessness of customers chasing novelty. He tightened his tie, appeared on television panels, and assured anyone who asked that updates were coming soon. But the updates never arrived with the urgency required, because Tun himself had become more consumed by appearances than by substance. He spent his days in meetings where he boasted more than he listened, his evenings at bars in Atit or lounges in GRA, where women clung to him, their laughter spilling over champagne glasses. His assistants, once sharp-eyed and diligent, began to slack, sensing that their boss was too distracted to notice. And when yet another contract slipped from his fingers into the hands of competitors, Tun blamed the market, blamed the economy, blamed sabotage, but never once considered that the true storm was rising from under his own roof. Bimbo, who saw all of this, remained silent, carrying her knowledge like a carefully folded letter she had no intention of delivering. She cooked his meals, greeted his guests, played her role so convincingly that even he did not suspect the dual life she led. But inside, her resolve hardened. She would no longer be merely the unseen architect of his fortune. She was building her own, brick by brick, deal by deal, in the shadows where he never thought to look. By the second year, the difference between their paths could no longer be hidden. Tun's company began bleeding money. Investors grew restless, staff left quietly, and his office, once buzzing with energy, carried the hollow echo of dwindling business. Meanwhile, Bimbo and Charles expanded their reach, registering offices in Lagos and Abuja, building partnerships with banks and logistics firms. Their software had become the industry standard, a name uttered in boardrooms with respect. Yet Tun still did not see the truth. He raged against competitors, suspected betrayal among his staff, and even hired consultants from abroad to diagnose his failing system. None of them could fix the rot because the rot was not technical. It was in his own arrogance, in his neglect of innovation, in his blindness to the people who once gave him strength. At home, the gulf between him and Bimbo grew wider. He spent more nights away, returning with excuses that smelled of alcohol and women's perfume. When he was home, he either buried himself in calls or sat in sullen silence, brooding over contracts lost. Bimbo, however, carried herself with serenity, as if untouched by his turbulence. She had learned the art of keeping her face unreadable, of saving her energy for the empire she was quietly building beyond his sight. It was a dangerous dance, but she performed it with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose in love and everything to gain in self-respect. The day the storm finally broke came not with thunder, but with a press release. Newspapers carried the headline of a revolutionary software firm that had overtaken the market, announcing partnerships with multinationals and endorsements from government agencies. Tund read the articles at his desk, his jaw tightening, his hand trembling around the paper. The name of the company was unfamiliar to him, but the product described was painfully close to his own, only sharper, cleaner, superior in every way. He ranted, tore the paper, called his staff useless, and accused rivals of stealing his ideas. He did not yet know that the rival he cursed was his own wife. That night, he came home late, threw his jacket across the couch, and sat in brooding silence. Bimbo served his food, her movements calm, her face unreadable. As he ate, muttering about betrayal and theft, she watched him, her eyes steady, her lips silent. She did not reveal her hand, not yet. For though the truth burned at her lips, she knew the timing of revelation was everything. Like a hunter who waits for the animal to step fully into the trap, she remained patient. She had built something solid, something that could not be snatched away, and soon the world would know. For now, she let him stew in his frustration, blind to the fact that the very woman sitting across from him at the dining table was the architect of his downfall. The restaurant was the kind of place Tund had once passed without entering, its tinted glass walls promising meals priced in quiet whispers rather than shouted bargains. Now it was his stage. He walked in on a humid Saturday afternoon with a young woman at his arm, her dress sharp enough to slice glances from other diners. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, and he basked in the sound like a man who mistook echoes for applause. The maitre d' recognized him, not for his dwindling empire but for the way he carried himself, chest out, gait confident, the old swagger still stitched into his steps even as the threads frayed. They were shown to a corner table, where soft jazz floated like perfume and waiters glided as if their shoes had rehearsed on invisible strings. He ordered without glancing at prices, his voice carrying enough authority to assure himself he was still someone. And then, like a hand suddenly pulling away a curtain, he saw her. Bimbo, in a waiter's apron, balancing a tray with the calm precision of someone used to carrying weight. His heart stuttered but recovered instantly, twisting the shock into ridicule. Laughter burst from him, too loud for the room, clattering against glass and cutlery. "Bimbo, now you be this?" he exclaimed, leaning back in his chair as though the sight amused him beyond measure. His companion tittered nervously, unsure whether to join in or shrink. "So this is where life throw you in? From madam in mansion to serving food? God day," he added, lifting his glass in mock salute. Conversations in nearby booths faltered, diners turning slightly, caught between curiosity and discomfort. Bimbo did not flinch. She set the tray down on another table, straightened, and met his laughter with a small smile that carried no shame, no apology, only a patience that unsettled more than anger would have. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly, then turned to walk away. Something in her voice, its evenness, its refusal to bend, planted a seed of unease in the pit of his chest, though he buried it under another bout of laughter. "See life," he muttered to his date, shaking his head. "See what happened when pride go too far." He did not realize that the mirror had been turned. The rest of the meal soured quietly, like stew left too long on low fire. His jokes landed flat, his companion's giggles brittle. He ordered more wine than he needed, filling the silence with the clink of glass, the scrape of cutlery, the performance of a man who believed in his own story. But under it all, the image of Bimbo in that apron clung to him like damp cloth. He tried to picture how she had fallen, what twist of fate had reduced her to serving plates, and the thought warmed him with a petty satisfaction. "She thought she was better than me," he told himself. "Now see, tables turn." Yet when she passed by again, collecting plates from another booth, he noticed the grace in her posture, the absence of bitterness in her eyes. There was no desperation in her step, no hollow exhaustion in her face. If anything, she carried herself with the calm of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. The dissonance gnawed at him. He turned his focus back to his date, boasting about old deals, recounting stories of conferences and panels, adding shine to past glories to cover present cracks. The woman listened with the glazed smile of someone who knew the rhythm of such men, the drumbeat of self-praise, the pauses for admiration, the loop of repetition. When the bill came, he paid in cash, overtipping with a flourish, as if generosity could erase the unease that shadowed him. Walking out into the afternoon glare, he held his companion's hand tightly, more for reassurance than affection, his laughter now brittle, his chest tight. He told himself he had seen Bimbo fall. What he had truly seen, though, was his own reflection bending in the glass walls of the restaurant, a man clinging to a crown no longer on his head. That evening, the city hummed in its usual way, okadas weaving like restless fish, hawkers shouting goods into the sunset, buses belching fumes while preachers promised salvation in portable speakers. But inside Tun's chest, the rhythm stumbled. At home, he poured himself a drink, pacing the living room like a general rehearsing excuses for a lost battle. He thought of calling a friend to share the story, to laugh again at the irony of Bimbo's fall, but something held him back. The laughter had tasted hollow the first time. Repeated, it might curdle completely. He told himself stories instead, that she must have squandered whatever little money the divorce had left her, that her stubborn pride had barred her from asking him for help, that fate had been kinder to him even in loss. He repeated these tales until they sounded plausible, though never solid. Sleep did not come easily. His dreams were fractured, tables laden with food tipping over, coins rolling out of reach, faces turning away mid-conversation. He woke before dawn, sweat slick on his skin, the silence of the house pressing in. He stepped onto the balcony and looked at the city stretching awake under the pale sky. Somewhere out there, she was carrying trays, he told himself, and he was still a man of means. He squared his shoulders, convinced himself he still held the upper hand. What he did not know was that the apron he had mocked was not a chain but a mask, and masks, when lifted, often reveal not weakness but power. Days passed, but the memory lingered like a pebble in his shoe. He avoided that restaurant, choosing others where the staff were strangers, where no ghost of his past might glide past carrying plates. Yet whispers began to catch him unguarded. A former client mentioned in passing that a new system had eased their operations. A colleague in Lagos referred to the people behind Kestrel, with respect that burned like acid in his ears. Even his staff, in hushed corners, compared their dwindling contracts to rumors of seamless reconciliations elsewhere. He dismissed them with sharp words, but unease hollowed him from within. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a man straining to keep a crown balanced on a trembling head. Pride had been his armor, but now it chafed, exposing the skin beneath. He remembered Bimbo's smile at the restaurant, not mocking, not defeated, but steady, and the memory scratched at him, a truth he could not name yet could not escape. And while he busied himself with distractions, new shoes, louder laughter, younger women, the city quietly shifted again, its weight tilting toward another name, one he had once shared meals and dreams with, one he had thought he had outgrown. The mask lifted on a night that began with nothing extraordinary, the kind of evening when Benin City seemed to exhale into itself. Traffic thinning to murmurs, generators coughing in intervals, street vendors closing pots with reluctant lids. Tund was at another dinner, this time with business acquaintances who no longer smiled as brightly when he arrived late. He had hoped the gathering would give him fresh contacts, perhaps rekindle the old admiration that once followed him like perfume. But the conversations drifted past him, talk of innovations and systems where his name no longer sat comfortably. He left early with his latest companion, a woman with a smile rehearsed for social media, and steered his SUV through streets he barely noticed anymore. When he stopped at a traffic light near Airport Road, his eyes caught a billboard on the corner, Kestrel's logo in bold lettering, flanked by testimonials from companies he had once courted. The tagline read, "Built for Africa's Rhythm," and underneath it, a smiling figure he almost recognized until the light changed and the car behind him honked impatiently. His chest tightened, but he shook it off, blaming shadows and coincidence. Still, the image lingered like a whisper in his skull. Days later, an invitation arrived at his office, a gala celebrating innovation in technology, hosted in one of the city's new glass hotels. His pride resisted at first, muttering that he had no interest in clapping for competitors, but curiosity gnawed at him until he agreed to attend. He walked into the ballroom with a forced smile, his suit pressed, his tie knotted tighter than his throat. Lights glittered off chandeliers, laughter and music blended, cameras clicked. And then the announcer's voice rose above the hum, naming the recipient of the award for technological excellence, the one whose software had redefined efficiency across states. The name struck him like a blow, echoing through the ballroom. Dr. Bimbo Adesawa. He froze, heart hammering, as she walked onto the stage, not in an apron, not with a tray, but in a gown that shimmered under the lights, her presence composed and regal. She took the award with a calm smile, thanking her team, speaking of patience, vision, resilience. The applause thundered, but in Tun's ears it sounded like judgment. His world tilted, his illusions crumbled. In that moment, he realized the apron had been a disguise, a quiet shield while she built her empire in shadows. The laughter he had wielded in the restaurant now returned to him, sharper, colder, a mirror reflecting his own folly. The revelation haunted him like a restless spirit. In the days after the gala, he attempted to reach her, first with phone calls unanswered, then with messages that bounced back without reply. He even drove past the restaurant where he had once mocked her, only to learn from the manager that it was part of her portfolio, one of many businesses under her company's umbrella. Each discovery tightened the noose around his pride, each silence cut deeper than words. His empire, already cracked, began to collapse in earnest. Clients migrated openly to Kestrel, his staff trickled away, investors stopped returning calls. He sat in his office surrounded by files that no longer promised anything, the air thick with the smell of dust and old carpet. The assistants who once hovered had melted away, leaving him with empty chairs. Nights became torture chambers of memory. He replayed the moment in the restaurant, her calm eyes, her quiet smile, until his chest ached with regret. In desperation, he drove to her new headquarters, a sleek building on the outskirts of GRA, its glass facade gleaming under the sun. Security guards stopped him at the gate, polite but firm, asking for an appointment he did not have. He begged, pleaded, told them his name, but they only shook their heads, explaining gently that Dr. Adesawa's schedule was full. Defeated, he sat in his car outside the gate, watching employees walk in and out, their badges gleaming, their steps brisk with purpose. He thought of how it could have been, how they might have stood there together, partners in triumph. His throat burned with the bitter taste of choices that could not be undone. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that he had lost not just a marriage, not just a company, but a future that had been offered to him with open hands and spurned for the fleeting applause of strangers. One evening, unable to bear the silence of his home, he drove again, not to her headquarters this time, but to her. By some chance, or perhaps design, he found her leaving a quiet dinner meeting in town. He stepped out of his car before he could think, calling her name with a voice cracked by desperation. She turned, surprised but not shaken, her gaze steady. For a long moment, the air between them held the weight of all that had been broken. He dropped to his knees on the pavement, not caring who watched, his hands outstretched like a beggar who had lost even shame. "Bimbo," he said, his voice trembling, "I was blind. I was foolish. Please forgive me. Give me one more chance. We can rebuild. We can start again." His words spilled, frantic and raw, his chest heaving with sobs that startled passers-by. But she only regarded him with the calm of someone who had walked through fire and no longer feared the flame. She bent slightly, placing a hand on his shoulder, not in reconciliation but in farewell. "Tund," she said softly, "forgiveness is not the same as return. I forgave you long ago, but our story has ended. You taught me pain, but also strength. I am grateful for both. But I cannot walk that road again." Her words fell like a final seal on a letter long written. He wept openly, his body shaking, but she turned and walked to her car, the driver opening the door, the taillights carrying her into the night. He remained kneeling, his shadow stretched long under the street lamp, a man undone not by fate, but by his own hands. In the weeks that followed, life adjusted itself the way cities always do. Bimbo's company flourished, expanding into other states, her name appearing in papers not as gossip, but as headline. She traveled often, not as someone's wife, but as herself, commanding respect without raising her voice. She remained humble, still cooking her own meals when time allowed, still smiling at neighbors, still carrying herself with the quiet dignity that had once been mistaken for weakness. Tund, meanwhile, shrank into the background of the city he had once strutted through. His cars were sold, his office space rented by others. His phone rang less until silence became its only song. He moved into a smaller flat, the kind where neighbors argued loudly through thin walls, the kind where nobody cared what your name had once meant. Sometimes he walked past billboards bearing Kestrel's logo, and each time it felt like a reminder carved into the skyline. He avoided restaurants, afraid of echoes, afraid of mirrors, afraid of remembering the day his laughter betrayed him. Yet in his solitude, there were lessons he could not ignore. He realized too late that pride is a leash that strangles slowly, that betrayal is not always shouted down but answered by distance, that brilliance shared with arrogance is often reclaimed by patience. And Bimbo, though she never gloated, became the quiet testament of that truth. Her story continued, not as vengeance but as resilience, not as a caution whispered in villages, but as a life lived fully. Tund remained where choices had placed him, staring at doors that would never open again, his tears long dried, his heart echoing with the sound of the laughter he once mistook for triumph. My people, you have heard this story. Pride can turn a palace into an empty hut, and wisdom, when carried with patience, can build empires from ashes. Never look down on the quiet ones, for calm waters can hide the deepest strength. And remember, wealth without discipline is like pouring water into a basket. It will never stay. Let us pray. May your wisdom never be wasted, amen. May your patience turn into prosperity, amen. May your helpers never turn into betrayers, amen. May the work of your hands bring honor, not shame, amen. And may you never be blind to the treasure standing beside you, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.